Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Joel Adorman. I'm the lead pastor. So glad you're with us today. To our guest, thanks so much for being here. If you're joining us online, we want to give a special welcome to you as well. We're so glad that you are taking the time out of your schedule, whatever you're doing, whether you're joining us live or watching us later in the week. And we know a lot of folks would check us out online before they ever join us in person. So while we're so glad you're there, we'll be super excited when you are able to be here. If you look over to your right, you'll see a balloon. Now, I want to tell you the quick story behind this balloon. First, wait for it. This is good. We put a balloon up every time someone commits their life to Jesus. White balloons means they commit their life to Jesus. A blue balloon means a baptism. Now, here's the story with that. That represents one of our junior hires who is at camp this weekend and committed their life to Jesus last night. So that's what we're celebrating today. It's possible we'll actually get to baptize him next week along with the other folks getting baptized. So, man, what a few weeks we've got in store. I want to start today. I want to tell you the beginning of the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth begins at a time in Israel's history when the judges ruled. Now, this was several thousand years ago. And in this message, Redeeming Love, we're going to talk about Ruth. But before we get to Ruth, you got to get the story and the situation that all these people were in. In this time of their history, they were in this season when the judges ruled, as I said, and the judges were best thought of as tribal chiefs. They weren't judges the way we might think of judges. They were more like just military leaders that God would raise up for a specific purpose, typically to conquer some enemy that Israel had. So to put it in terms of biblical history, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and they wander in the desert. Joshua leads them into the promised land. When Joshua dies, the judges take over. And there's just a succession of judge after the other. Here's the other thing that happened. While the judges ruled, like if this is where their morality started, the people of Israel just started going just down the toilet. Their morality got worse and worse and worse with every successive judge. And at the end of Judges is when they finally decide they get a king. But we're not going to get that far yet. We're still in the middle of the Judges. And then what would also happen in the ancient Near Eastern world, what still happens today, is famine. There would be times when it wouldn't rain enough. And so when you're in an agrarian culture and you're living in an arid to semi-arid environment, you're dependent upon rain. Now, we in the valley, we understand this. We live and die by rain and snowfall. So did they. But they had no irrigation system. They had no way to store this. So if the rain didn't come, that means there was no harvest. So oftentimes they would stockpile in the cities. So when they had a bad harvest or they had a famine, they would have enough food to keep people sustained until the next harvest, like a year later. Well, sometimes these would be naturally occurring events. Famine happens because it's a drought, and that's just the way nature works. But sometimes God would send a famine to his people as a way to get them to come back to him. Now, when the story of Ruth unfolds at the beginning, we don't know which it is. We just know that they're in this time frame between Joshua and the first king, somewhere in there, and it's a famine. And this famine was so bad and so severe that even in the city or the town of Bethlehem, which is actually Hebrew for the house of bread, there was no bread. It was so bad that the house of bread was broke. They didn't have any food. Nobody had food. And so a family, a couple named Elimelech and Naomi, were faced with a very, very tough decision. Stay in Bethlehem and starve, watch their sons Mahlon and Chilion starve with them, or relocate. Now, relocation in times of famine wasn't that uncommon. People would move all the time. They'd go where the food was. You'd go where there was some rain or some harvest or something you could eat or something you could trade to get food. But it was so bad that Naomi and Elimelech decided they would just head out to Moab. Now, if there was a soundtrack to this, we would hear ominous music right here. They should have never gone to Moab. These were their enemies. These were probably one of the biggest problems Israel ever had as they entered into the promised land. The Moabites were their constant enemy and a constant threat. But Elimelech and Naomi took their chances. They left their family. They left their friends. They left the place of God's provision and God's promise and everything he had told them to do, and they struck out on their own, and they head to Moab along with their sons, Mahlon and Chilion. No sooner do they arrive that tragedy strikes, and Elimelech dies. So now Naomi is a widow in the ancient Near Eastern world, left with these two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. she doesn't have much to do anymore. Now, everything they had planned on didn't quite work out, but as time would have it, Mahlon and Chilion married, and they married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, one was named Ruth. Cue more ominous music, because the Word of God had already told them to not marry women that were not in the family of faith, that were not Jewish people, that were not the people of God. So you have sin of leaving compounded with sin of marrying these foreign women who were not the people of God. They were pagan women. Now, 10 years goes by. Life's pretty good. You don't hear much about Naomi or Mahlon, Chilion, Orpah, and Ruth until tragedy strikes again. And Mahlon and Chilion die. So now you have the widow Naomi, and now you have these daughters-in-law that are also widows, Orpah and Ruth. But as it would happen to be, Naomi heard that there was food again in Bethlehem, that the house of bread had bread again, and that the nation of Israel had food. It had been 10 years. It kind of stands to reason, but she had heard this now. And finally, she wakes up and goes, okay, I've got nothing in Moab. I've got no husband. I have no prospects. I have these daughters-in-law. I have no sons. It's time to go back. It's about the first right decision she's made yet. But she decides to go back, but now she's got this problem because she's got these two daughters-in-law that are not Israelites. They're Moabites. They're not the people of God. Naomi was only going to survive by going back and depending upon her family, cousins and maybe nieces and nephews, to take her in and give her food. Remember, she's a widow and she had no power to do anything about that. She's too old at this point to remarry. So she's completely dependent upon her family taking care of her, and she's not seen them in over 10 years. And remember, she left them. So she has to solve this problem. So she gathers together her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she says, girls, go back to your mother's homes. I have nothing to offer you. I have no husband. And even if I did find a husband and I had sons tonight, would you wait around until they're old enough to marry? No. Your odds are better off going back to your mother's homes, finding a husband, living a good life. And she blesses them. She says, you've been good to me. You've been a blessing to me. You've been a blessing to my family. And she was sad about this, but she also knows this is the best thing for them. But also, let's remember, she is concerned about her own ability to even find sustenance. It's highly unlikely that anybody in her homeland was going to be interested in feeding a couple of Moabites. They'd rather them starve. So Naomi's really doing the best thing for them, but also it's the best thing for her too. I mean, this just wasn't going to work any other way. Well, Orpah does the math. I think Orpah thinks it through and she realizes, you know what? Mother-in-law Naomi is right. My odds are better off going back to my mother's house and letting her find me a new husband than going with her back to this land that I'm not going to be welcome. It's not my people. That isn't my religion. I mean, Moabites look different than Jewish people. They weren't going to blend in. So she said, okay, I'll take my chances. So with tears and hugs and kisses, Orpah parts ways. But Ruth, she doesn't go along with Naomi's plan. She clings to Naomi. And then picking it up at verse 15 in Ruth chapter 1, we read this. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, that's an understatement. She stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Remember, it's been over 10 years. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? They probably thought she was dead. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. She said, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which is the Hebrew word for bitterness. She says, call me bitter because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now it's interesting to note that Naomi was never called Mara, even once past this. No one adopted this name for her. And yet, her life was pretty sour. She lost her husband. Her source of sustenance she had lost. And 10 years later, she loses her sons. They were the ones taking care of her. Now she comes back with nothing, except a Moabite in tow that nobody really wanted to deal with anyway because it was a Moabite. It's hard to really blame Naomi for feeling this way. But yet there she was, saying, don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter because the Lord has afflicted me. The Lord has brought this calamity on me. I went away full. I came back with nothing except her. And yet there's this little footnote at the tail end of chapter 1 that's easy for us to miss, but it sets up the next 3 weeks of this story. That they were returning when the barley harvest was beginning. It had been over 10 years since they left. They'd been gone a long time, and there had been constant harvest. There'd been constant planting. There'd been constant making bread. Life went on in Israel. Life went on in Moab. But when she got her head put on right, she comes back at the perfect time. You're going to see next week why it's so perfect. And what I find fascinating about the whole book of Ruth, what I love even about chapter 1, is that God is silent. It's one of the 2 books in the whole Bible that God doesn't actually directly say or do anything. The other one is Esther. That he doesn't do or say anything. He's silent. And yet, even in this, you can see his hand working, that at the right time, they came back at a perfect moment. Now let's be really honest. Elimelech and Naomi, with their sons Mahlon and Chilion, should have never been in Moab. They had no business in Moab. Moab represented everywhere they should not be. And Bethlehem was the place of the Lord's promise and provision. That was where their family were. That every chance they would have had in the Lord was there. They left there to go to Moab. They should have never been there. And when catastrophe struck, Naomi should have gone, whew, all right, boys, saddle up. We're heading back. I'm taking no chances. She didn't. She stayed. Her sons married these pagan women. I mean, she even tells them after 10 years, she says, hey, go back to your gods. I mean, it wasn't until Ruth makes that declaration that she even makes a movement towards the God of Israel. Finally, then she goes, your God is my God. She makes this profession of faith, as it were. Now, no doubt she had seen it in Naomi's life. No doubt she had seen Naomi walking out her faith in other ways. One mistake doesn't define someone forever. But Elimelech and Naomi should have never been there. And then they blamed God when things went wrong. And Naomi blamed God for everything that went wrong when it was just a consequence of her behavior. It was the natural consequence of what she did. But are we so different? How many times do we strike out on some venture, fall flat on our face, look up at God and go, why'd you do that? How many times do we wallow in sin because we think it's fun and we like it? And then when the natural consequences of sin catch up with us, we go, where are you at? Why didn't you deliver me? How many times do we take God's silence, like he was at the beginning of the book of Ruth? How many times do we take his silence as consent to go out and do something that we know his words already told us not to? And then get mad at him because we fail. How many times do we wallow in our own personal Moab while the whole time God is going, I'm over here. I never promised to be with you there. I never said I'd lead you there. I said I'd be here. How many times do we say, well, I didn't see a flashing neon sign, so I just thought I could go ahead and do it. When God has already said, don't. Or we step into something thinking, well, I didn't have some gigantic brick wall. God should have just closed that door. And then we blame him for walking through it. Are we really that different? Because then we come back empty-handed saying, God has afflicted me. God has failed me. The whole time he's actually been working through your mistakes and my mistakes to set up the rest of our story that we're going to get to later. See, it's easy to follow God with a flashing neon sign. It's easy to follow him if he says, hey, this way. And you say, okay. It's easy when he closes the door so hard that you cannot see past it. And you say, okay, I'm obviously not supposed to go there. Well, let's go back over here. And then he closes that door. That's easy. That's not really trust at that point. That's just obedience because you don't have an option. See, that's not trust. Trust is not listening to the neon signs. Trust is traveling by faith during the Lord's silence. Trust is doing what we're supposed to be doing while we wait for the stuff we don't know yet. Trust is traveling by faith during the Lord's silence. It's trusting his heart when you can't see or feel his hands. Trust is traveling by faith during the Lord's silence. And get this, there's a blessing for this. The Bible says there's a blessing for trusting the Lord. There's a blessing for us traveling by faith when he is actually silent. We don't have the flashing neon signs. Psalm 40, verse 4 and 5 says this, blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of all your deeds, there would be too many to declare. Your trust is traveling by faith during the Lord's silence. It's not demanding flashing neon signs. It's doing what we know while we wait for the parts we don't. It's traveling by faith. It's moving in his ways. Fellow disciple of Jesus, I got a really hard question for you. Are you traveling in Moab or towards Bethlehem? Moab is the place you should not be. It is the sin that you and I entertain far too often. That's Moab. It's the place where God's blessing is not going to be found, but we're there anyway. Just like Elimelech and Naomi, they were there. Now, I know full well that it was Elimelech and Naomi and Mahlon and Chilion, all these mistakes lined up that brought Ruth into the story. And you're going to find out, if you've never read the book of Ruth, I highly recommend you do it this afternoon. It'll take you probably 20 or 30 minutes. It's a short book. It's 4 chapters long. And Ruth is a tiny part of this week's passage, but you're going to see why the book is named after her in just another week. And yes, God used that to bring Ruth into the story, and she played a major part in the history of Jesus. But that doesn't mean Elimelech and Naomi were right in the first place. What it means is God has a way of taking the messes we make and turning a message out of it. That just means he's merciful and gracious and doesn't give us everything we deserve. Instead, he shows grace and he brings us back, and then he does something out of that. He works all things together. He pulls all these pieces together even when we break them. Ruth is a story of God's grace and mercy. But it doesn't mean that chapter 1 was the right behavior. That's what I love about the Old Testament. Many times it doesn't tell you what was supposed to happen. It tells you here's the flawed humanity and what they really did. But here's how God worked in sometimes very quiet ways behind the scenes to bring about an ending that you never saw coming. You see, I think sometimes we mistake emotional and spiritual pain as just kind of a rite of passage. But what if emotional and spiritual pain is actually an invitation to lean into the Lord? What if it's an opportunity for us to say, I'm hurting, Lord. I'm frustrated and I'm angry. I feel very Mara today. I feel very bitter today. I feel very bitter right now. I don't know where. What if that's an invitation to lean in and talk to him? To increase your personal worship time. Around here we call it taking your sips, S-I-P-S. If you stop by our guest center, we're going to give you a bunch of stuff that explains that. For the regular folks that are here a lot, you probably heard us talking about it. If you want more bookmarks, coasters, and such, go to the Info Center and get it. We talk a lot about this because emotional and spiritual pain is not always a sign of sin, but it is an invitation for us to rest in the Lord and to lean into Him. And frankly, to see if there's anything in us that He needs to remove, anything we need to fix. Because, like the old song says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. You see, because when the lights went out, when He went silent, who moved? We did. We moved. And so if you are in Moab today, if you're in that place you do not need to be, if you're entertaining that sin in your life for the umpteenth year, if you are still battling that same demon you have been battling, if you are wandering through Moab and you're trying to get it right, it's not going to be found in that place. That is not where God's blessing is. It's going to be found by turning around and heading back to Bethlehem, heading back to the place of God's provision and God's promise and God's power. And it's not a place physically, it's a place in our heart. It's where our heart says, it's my fault that this has happened. I'm the cause of this. And I'm coming back. And you know the best news of all? The Father's already waiting, arms open. You see, the devil knows everything you've done wrong, and he's going to tell you every shred of it. He's going to tell you every time you failed, every time you've stumbled, every time you have marred. He's going to tell you every time you have been where you should not be. He's going to tell you every mistake you've made. He's going to list them all for you. He's going to make sure you know it. Jesus looks at you. He calls you by name, and He says, come, and let us talk this through. Though your sins are like scarlet, I'll make them white as snow. He knows your sin, and He calls you by name, and He says, you're mine. Naomi was still His, even though she had made some pretty big mistakes. The Lord still called her back at the right moment. And the Lord brought Ruth into the story because He needed her in the story. So if you're wandering in Moab, that is not the end of your story. But it is that moment you got to stop and you got to turn around. You got to head back to Bethlehem. You got to head back to that place where you say, Lord, I'm the cause of all of that. But I'm coming home. And He's waiting, arms open, waiting. That's why we celebrate baptisms around here. It's that visual sign of what God does in our hearts. That He takes us wherever we are and He takes that mess and He turns it into something amazing. Only God can do that. Only God can write a story as amazing as Ruth's. Only God can take Naomi, or Mara as she wanted to be called, and truly make her understand what Naomi really means. But that's next week and the week following that you're going to have to wait for that. See, the amazing thing is that even when we're in the middle of Moab, He's already there. He's already whispering. He's already calling us back to where we walked off that pathway. Because trust is not following the flashing neon sign when it's easy. Trust is traveling by faith when the Lord is silent and when we can't hear. And knowing that wherever we find ourselves, in Moab or somewhere between there and getting back to Bethlehem where we're supposed to be, we find that the whole way He's never left us. He's never dropped us. He's never forgotten us. He's already there. Don't ever forget it.